The rise and fall of Woolworths in Britain. For decades, there was one shop that felt impossible to avoid on the British high street. You saw it in city centres, small towns, shopping precincts. It sold almost everything. Pick and mix sweets, toys, music, school supplies, homeware. And for millions of people in Britain, Woolworths wasn't just a shop. It was part of growing up. At its peak, there were over 1,000 Woolworths stores across the UK. Entire generations assumed it would always be there. Then suddenly it wasn't. And there's one decision near the end of this story that many people still believe sealed its fate. Here's the rise and fall of Woolworths. 1. The American store that Britain adopted. Woolworths didn't begin in Britain. It began in America. Founded by Frank Winfield Woolworth in the late 1800s, the company built its reputation around one simple idea: affordable products for ordinary people. At a time when many shops kept products behind counters, Woolworths encouraged customers to walk around and browse freely. That seems normal now. Back then, it felt modern. The first British Woolworths store opened in Liverpool in 1909, and it worked almost immediately. Because Britain itself was changing rapidly, cities were growing, working-class families finally had slightly more disposable income, and Woolworths understood something important. People didn't just want necessities anymore. They wanted choice. By the 1930s, Woolworths had already opened hundreds of stores across Britain, making it one of the fastest-growing retail chains the country had ever seen. And unlike many traditional shops, Woolworths felt relaxed. You could browse without pressure. Over time, Britain didn't just accept Woolworths. It adopted it completely. As Britain modernized further, Woolworths expanded alongside it. 2. The store that sold everything. Woolworths wasn't specialized. That was the genius of it. You could walk in for batteries and leave with sweets, wrapping paper, shampoo, records, and a football. It sold almost everything. And because of that, almost everyone went there. Children loved the toy section. Parents used it for practical shopping. Teenagers drifted toward the music aisle. At a time when most high street shops focused on one category, Woolworths combined them all. And that created something powerful. People stayed longer, browsed more, bought things they never planned to buy. The stores constantly changed with the seasons: school supplies in late summer, Christmas decorations appearing months early, chocolate eggs at Easter. That variety kept people coming back. And in many towns, Woolworths became one of the busiest stores on the entire high street. But one section became more famous than everything else. 3. The pick and mix counter. For many British children, this was Woolworths. The pick and mix counter, rows of colourful tubs, paper bags hanging nearby, the smell of sugar filling the air. You'd grab the scoop, then begin the impossible task of choosing. Chocolate raisins, jelly snakes, white mice, fried eggs. Every decision mattered. Because weight mattered. Too many heavy sweets, and suddenly the price climbed fast. Some kids carefully planned their selections. Others just filled the bag recklessly and hoped for the best. And that weighing moment at the counter felt strangely important. Here's what made it so successful. Pick and mix was one of the most profitable parts of the entire store. Woolworths reportedly sold millions of pounds worth of pick and mix every year during its peak. And psychologically, it worked perfectly. Because it didn't just feel like buying sweets. It felt like an experience. By the 1970s and 80s, Woolworths felt almost untouchable. 4. The golden era of the British high street. By the late 20th century, Woolworths had become part of everyday British life. Saturday shopping trips, back-to-school supplies, Birthday presents, Christmas decorations covering entire aisles. At its peak, Woolworths employed around 30,000 people across the UK. Entire town centres relied on it to attract shoppers. And here's something people often forget. The high street itself was still dominant. Retail parks barely existed. Online shopping didn't exist at all, which meant stores like Woolworths weren't competing with phones or websites. They were competing for physical attention, and Woolworths was very good at winning it. The stores adapted constantly throughout the year. Summer toys one month, school uniforms the next, then suddenly Christmas arrived early. For many children, the Woolworths toy aisle at Christmas felt enormous, exciting, almost magical. Which is why so many people assumed Woolworths would last forever. The retail world around it was beginning to change. 5. Supermarkets started selling everything. By the 1980s and 90s, supermarkets began expanding aggressively across Britain. Chains like Tesco, Asda, and Sainsbury's weren't just selling food anymore. They started selling toys, electronics, stationery, music, homeware. Exactly the categories Woolworths depended on, and supermarkets had one major advantage: scale. Bigger stores, larger supply chains, lower prices. That slowly chipped away at Woolworths' position, because supermarkets could afford to sell some products incredibly cheaply, just to get customers through the door. And once families were already there buying groceries, they often bought everything else too. People stopped making separate trips into town. Convenience started winning. And Woolworths found itself trapped in a difficult middle ground. Not as cheap as supermarkets, not as modern as specialist retailers, and soon not as convenient as online shopping either. Even if customers didn't realize it yet, the foundations underneath Woolworths were already beginning to crack, and one area in particular would become incredibly important. 6. Woolworths bet big on music and entertainment. By the 1990s, Woolworths had become far more than a place for sweets and stationery. Music was now a huge part of the business. CDs, cassette tapes, video games, DVDs. Teenagers gathered around chart displays looking for the latest singles, and for a while it worked brilliantly. During the late 1990s, the UK music industry was booming. British consumers were buying hundreds of millions of CDs every year. Woolworths became one of the biggest entertainment sellers in Britain. But there was one major problem. The strategy depended on physical media staying popular. Then, the internet changed everything. Music downloads appeared. Online retailers offered cheaper prices. Streaming slowly emerged. And one of Woolworths' biggest strengths suddenly became a weakness. Retail analysts later argued the company became too dependent on categories that technology was rapidly replacing. At the same time, customers were beginning to notice something else. 7. The stores started feeling old-fashioned. Woolworths still had customers, still had recognition. But many stores were beginning to feel dated. The layouts felt crowded. Some branches had dim lighting. Shelves looked cluttered compared to newer retailers. Meanwhile, competitors felt cleaner. And perception matters in retail, because once shoppers start seeing a store as old-fashioned, it becomes difficult to reverse, especially with younger customers. By the early 2000s, customer surveys increasingly described some Woolworths branches as tired and behind the times. That became a serious issue. Because while older generations still trusted the brand, younger shoppers were drifting elsewhere, and eventually toward online shopping. But even then, few people expected what happened next. 8. The financial crisis hit at the worst possible time. In 2008, the global financial crisis hit Britain hard. People spent less money, retail sales slowed sharply, and Woolworths was already struggling. The company was dealing with falling entertainment sales, heavy competition, and aging stores. Now the economy itself was collapsing around it. In November 2008, Woolworths entered administration. For many people, the news felt surreal, because Woolworths didn't feel like an ordinary business. It felt permanent. But within weeks, closing down posters appeared in windows across the country. Shelves emptied rapidly. Queues formed around stores looking for discounts. Meanwhile, around 27,000 UK jobs were put at risk, making it one of Britain's largest retail collapses in decades. And suddenly, a shop that had existed for generations disappeared almost overnight. For millions of people, though, the closure felt strangely personal. 9. Why Britain still misses Woolworths. People don't just remember Woolworths because of what it sold. They remember how it felt. The smell of pick and mix, the toy aisle before Christmas, buying school supplies before September. It became tied to routines, and those routines became memories. That's why people still talk about it now. Not because it was luxurious, not because it was perfect, but because it felt familiar. Psychologists often point out that nostalgia is strongest when attached to repeated everyday experiences, which explains why Woolworths still creates such a strong emotional reaction. Even long after closure, polls continued ranking Woolworths among Britain's most missed high street stores. Because people weren't just mourning a retailer, they were mourning a version of the high street itself. Even today, people still wonder if a shop like Woolworths could ever work again. 10. Could Woolworths ever return? Technically, the Woolworths name still exists in limited online forms, but the original high street chain is gone, and many people still ask the same question. Could it come back? Maybe. But the world it thrived in has changed completely. Online shopping dominates huge parts of retail. Retail parks replaced many town centers, and the kind of slow browsing Woolworths depended on happens far less often today. By 2025, online shopping accounted for roughly a quarter of all UK retail sales. Modern retail is built around speed. Woolworths belonged to a different era, an era where people wandered through shops without rushing, where high streets felt social, where browsing itself was part of the experience. And maybe that's why people still miss it so much. Because Woolworths wasn't just a retailer. It represented a version of Britain that feels increasingly distant now. So now we're curious. What do you remember most about Woolworths, and what would you bring back first? Let us know in the comments.